Jai Hind, Namaste, hello and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav and in this video we'll be discussing selected topics from the Hindu and Indian Express for the date 8th of October 2020. Now in this video we'll be discussing the following topics. Supreme Court on Shaheen Bagh. So we'll discuss the observations that Supreme Court has made regarding the Shaheen Bagh protest. It basically said that protesters cannot illegally occupy public spaces. They have to practice their right to protest at designated places only, right? And there are other things. Supreme Court made comments about the use of social media. It also had to say something about the movement getting out of control. So many things. So we'll just see. And this judgment will have implications for future protest movements in India, right? Then India can be among top 5 in defense industry. So this is the statement which was made by our Raksha Mantri. So there are some important points about the defense industry in India. So that is why I have included this here. Then GJM demands formation of Gorkhaland state. So we'll just have a brief look at what is the Gorkhaland state and what is GJM demanding, what is GJM, right? Then India, Japan finalized text of pact for AI 5G, very, very important. So it was the 13th meeting between our foreign ministers as part of a mechanism that is there between India and Japan. And they have signed a crucial pact for cooperation in the fields of AI and 5G. And this becomes all the more important in the light of the fact that Japan and India are both trying to reduce their dependence on Chinese equipment, especially Huawei. Japan has, for all practical purposes, shut out Huawei from 5G trials. India has not made it clear, but India wants to shut off Huawei from 5G trials. So this is important. They have also agreed to cooperate in the field of protection of critical infrastructure and many other critical areas. So we'll see that. Then pandemic could push 150 million into extreme poverty. So this is a statement by the World Bank. They have made some points. So we'll see how this could happen and we'll also see what is extreme poverty as per World Bank. Then Google facing antitrust case in India over smart TVs. So these days Google is in news for the wrong reasons. So this one is about antitrust case. So basically Google is using its dominant position in Android operating system and is not letting the developers to modify the Android system for using in smart TVs. So we'll see what is it. And it is not the first antitrust case Google is facing in India. As a matter of fact, this is the 4th major antitrust case. And India is not the only country where Google is facing antitrust case. So we'll see all about that. Then natural gas marketing reforms get cabinet nod. So we'll see what are the reforms, right? Then we have also included 4 editorials, 3 from the Hindu and 1 from Indian Express. The one from Indian Express is extremely good. Surprisingly, this is about making AI work for India. None of these editorials have any nonsense opinions. So that is why we have included them. So making AI work for India is very, very good. It tells us about the possibilities and opportunities for India in the field of AI, what is the global status for AI market, right? Then it also tells us what are the applications of AI in different areas and it gives us examples where AI is already being implemented in India. So I would tell you that this is one of those editorials where each and every line and sentence is important. So this is very, very important. Then the cost of political posturing. So basically Trump has increased the minimum wage for all those who are going to US on H-1B visas. So what are its implications? We'll discuss that. Then playing catch up in flood forecasting technologies. So this basically tells us about the flood forecasting technologies that are used in India, how they're outdated. And it also introduces us to the technologies being used in the West called the ensemble technology. It tells us about a concept called lead time, which is basically the gap between the forecast and actual flood event happening. So in India, this lead time is just 1 day in most cases, and in some places it is as much as 3 days. That is a very poor time. But in foreign countries, the developed countries, they are using ensemble method, and for them the lead time is 7 to 10 days. So at times this gets very, very technical. We'll not get into technological things. We'll just understand it. I have simplified it for you as much as I could. Then gig work and its skewed terms. So this is about the labor laws and we'll discuss who are the gig workers and what facilities or entitlements or rights are they entitled under the new labor reform laws, right? And for the sake of your convenience, I've also added timestamps in the description. So if you want to skip to particular topic or article, just click that timestamp and it will take you there. Even if you miss the entire one, please do not miss this one because this is very, very important. So these are all the things we'll be discussing. Now let's get started. Playing catch up in flood forecasting technology. Now this editorial again is from the Hindu. Now this talks about flood forecasting models that we follow in India. At times it becomes too technical for your examination or even for you to know in daily life. So I have tried to simplify it. So some parts I have written like this and others I will be telling you from here. So first of all, there are some concepts like lead time, that the time between issuance of forecast and flood events. That is when you give a warning that there is going to be a flood and actual flood event, the time difference. Now in India, the difference is only 1 day largely. Now we have adopted a new model. So in some places it has gone up to 3 days, but still by and large it is 1 day. And why? Because we are using a deterministic forecast modeling based on rising and falling water level. So it is a very rudimentary and old method where you just see that if the river level is rising, then you give a flood forecast, and that is why it leads to such a low lead time, because 1 day is nothing. It does not give any time for the grassroots and implementing agencies to actually take any disaster relief or rehabilitation work, right? So that is the problem. Now in the Western countries, they follow an ensemble forecast, and that gives a lead time of 7 to 10 days with probability assigned to different scenarios. So they basically give a range of 7 to 10 days, and then they also tell that this could happen with this much probability, this could happen with this much probability. So this is much more sophisticated and balanced forecast method than what we are following. Now why is that so? Because first of all, our method itself is outdated and not that accurate. Secondly, we are following an outdated statistical model, right? Now, first let us understand what is the whole architecture of flood warning or flood forecasting in India. So India's warning system, problem of multiple agencies. Now what the problem is that in India, we have multiple agencies doing different parts of works of flood analysis. So there is no integrated work, and that is why it leads to a problem of lead time of 1 day, among other things. So there is IMD, which gives the meteorological and weather forecasts. So it gives the rainfall forecast, and that forecast is also known as quantitative precipitation forecast or QPF, right? So IMD would basically tell that how much rainfall is going to happen. If rainfall is more in flood prone area, that means there would be flood, right? Now IMD transfers this forecast to CWC, which is the Central Water Commission. Now it is the job of CWC to provide flood forecast at various river points. Now at the grassroots level are disaster management authorities and local administration, which are the end users. So IMD rainfall prediction, CWC flood forecast based on the IMD data, and then it disseminates that data to the disaster management authorities and local administration at the grassroots level, which are the end users, right? Now the advancement of flood forecasting, it depends on how quickly the IMD gives the QPF forecast, that is the rainfall forecast, how quickly it can give that forecast, then how quickly CWC integrate that forecast and disseminate data to end user agency. Now why I am using this word quickly? Because there is a technology gap between IMD and CWC. In some areas, IMD is technologically superior, and in some other areas, CWC is using superior technology. So there is a problem of integration, and this problem leads to delays in integration and dissemination of data to the end user agencies, and the end product is that the lead time is very, very low. Now he tells us that India has recently moved to using hydrological or simply rainfall runoff models capable of being coupled with QPF. So a lead time of 3 days is sporadic in India and at selective river points. So like I said, at some places because of this hydrological model, the lead time has come up to 3 days, but by and large it is 1 day. Now forecasting errors increase and burden of interpretation shifts to hapless end user agency. The outcome is an increase in flood risk and disaster. So what happens that IMD makes forecasting mistakes, then that mistake is shifted to CWC, then CWC shifts that mistake to the implementing agencies, and they have to bear the brunt right? Because they are the ones who are implementing it. So failure of these two costs very heavily the end users, that are the disaster management authorities and local administration. Now, like I said, apart from all those things, we are also using outdated statistical model and outdated technologies and a lack of technological parity between multiple agencies, like I told you, between CWC and IMD, and their poor water governance decrease crucial lead time. Now he's also telling us that there are talks that Google is using AI method to forecast floods in India. But what is happening is that it is not wide scale, and Google has adopted that hydrological data and forecast models derived from various river basins across the world for training AI to issue flood alerts in India. But this is not wide scale and this is not fully implemented yet. So this is just a misnomer that we are totally using the Google AI. Then not uniform across India. Like I said, that some places are using hydrological model. Now he says that even for IMD to properly predict the QPF or the rainfall, it needs to have better Doppler weather radars. At present, it has 36 Doppler weather radars, but to cover India, it would need at least 100 S-band dense radar network. Now you don't need to get into the technicality. All you need to know is the name Doppler weather radar. Presently, we have 36. We need at least 80 to have proper predictions. He's saying that else the limitations of altitude, range, band, density of radars and its extensive maintenance enlarge the forecast error in QPF, which would ultimately result in CWC's flood forecast. Then the error margin is increased. Then that point only, that outdated technologies and lack of technological parity leads to decrease in the lead time. Now, he is also telling us that the global weather phenomena is chaotic. For instance, flap of a butterfly wings in Chennai can create tornado in Tokyo. And that is actually true because the weather phenomena is closely intertwined and it is very complex, right? So he's saying that any small changes in initial conditions of a weather model results in an output that is completely unexpected. And we are already using outdated methods. So that is why the problem is exaggerated. The developed world has shifted from deterministic forecasting towards ensemble weather models, right? Which gives a lead time of 7 to 10 days. That measures uncertainty by causing perturbations in initial conditions. So this is the probability assignment that you get in ensemble model, that it gives different probability to different scenarios. So that is how it connects those scenarios. Now he says that India has a long way to go before mastering this model, and IMD is already using Piyush and Mihir 6.8 petaflop supercomputers. So this is also a piece of information that you need. But the forecasting agency has still to catch up with advanced technology and achieve technological parity with IMD in order to couple ensemble forecast to its hydrological model. So IMD and CWC need to have a technological parity to couple the hydrological and ensemble models. So this is the important part, and this is all that you need to know about this editorial. I have given you a summary. I have also read some points. Apart from that, it is too technical for you to understand, so you can leave it. You just need to know what is lead time, what type of model we are using, just the name. You don't need to get into nitty-gritties. Then what is the ensemble model? Then what are the problems like outdated statistical model we are following? Then the technological mismatch between CWC and IMD. And what is the warning system procedure in India? That 3 agencies are involved: IMD, CWC and the disaster management authorities and local administrations. So this is about this editorial. Supreme Court on Shaheen Bagh. So there was a petition in the Supreme Court pending for a very long time, and Supreme Court now has given its decision on the whole Shaheen Bagh case. So let us look at what the observations have been made by Supreme Court. The court has given some very balanced opinions, and they can set precedents for future cases and future instances of protests as well. So let us look at what Supreme Court has said. Now, first of all, Supreme Court plainly refused the indefinite occupation of public road by any kind of protest, including the Shaheen Bagh protesters. It said that it was unacceptable. The court said that democracy and dissent, they go hand in hand. In fact, it is one of the cornerstones of a democracy that you have the right to dissent. No problem with that. But the court said that the demonstrations expressing the dissent have to be at designated places, because you cannot cripple public system or public transport or public convenience just for dissent. Because in a democracy, different sections have different grievances. So it would be very difficult, because one section would be having a grievance over something, then the other section would be having a grievance over something. So virtually there would be a situation where the whole city or country would be blocked. So Supreme Court has said that it should be done at only the designated places. Then the court said that the seeds of protest and dissent, they were sown deep during the freedom struggle. No problem with that. But the dissent against the colonial rule that was in the past, it cannot be equated to the dissent in a self-ruled democracy where a popular government is elected, right? In a democracy, you have the right of free speech and you have the right to protest peacefully. And these are the rights that should indeed be treasured. They should always be encouraged and respected. No problems. But there are some reasonable restrictions on these rights in the interests of sovereignty, integrity, and public order. And police regulations also play a role in these restrictions. The court said that the fundamental rights, they do not live in isolation, because there has to be a balance between your right and the right of other people. For example, one section has a right to protest and we should totally support their right to protest, but other people, they also have the right to free movement. Then why should one section's right trample the right of other sections? That is what the court is saying. The right of protester has to be balanced with the right of commuter, and both should coexist in a mutual respect. Both should coexist in mutual respect. One should not trample the other. The court also observed that the movement had gone out of hand. For example, there was an absence of leadership. There were too many influencers and groups, and at times they were working at cross purposes, and that led to the movement getting out of hand. And the court also suggested that the movement might have gone out of hand of women protesters as well, because they were all holed up in a tent, and that tent was surrounded by a large periphery of protesters, male protesters. So even if they wanted to move out, they were not allowed to, or probably not allowed to, as per the Supreme Court's observation based on some reports. Then the court also opined on the role of technology and social media. The court said that this movement seemed typical of many digitally fueled leaderless events of dissent in modern times. We have seen everywhere, for example, Hong Kong protests and protests in other countries. They all have been fueled by social media. So social media is playing the dual role these days. On one hand, it gives opportunity for different sections of people to come together and raise their voice, but also it leads to chaos. Technology and social media both empower and weaken mass movements. There is a flip side that social media channels, they are fraught with danger and can lead to creation of highly polarized environments. And they often see parallel conversation with no constructive outcome. So you can see that on different social media platforms, people abusing each other and engaging in endless conversations, and there are basically not even debates. They are just fighting and trying to prove each other wrong, but in the end nobody concedes. So that is how it goes. So the court has observed that this is what happens in social media, and in the process the hate or the prejudices, they get strengthened. The court also made observations about the role of Delhi High Court and the Delhi administration. The court said that the High Court should have positively dealt with the situation and not left it in a fluid situation. The court also said that the administration should have talked to the protesters, and it was entirely the responsibility of the administration to prevent encroachment in public spaces. The administration should not wait for court's orders to actually fire a gun from their shoulder. They should be able to take their own decisions. That is what the court has said. So these are the set of observations that the Supreme Court made in the Shaheen Bagh case, and they would be setting precedents for future protests and movements in India. India-Japan finalized text of pact for AI and 5G. So our foreign minister has gone to Tokyo for the Quad meeting, right? Quad foreign ministers meeting. We discussed that. So on the sidelines of it, there was also the 13th India-Japan foreign ministers strategic dialogue. So at this dialogue, there was finalization of text for cybersecurity arrangement, which will promote cooperation in key areas including 5G and AI. Now, what are the specific areas? It would enable cooperation in capacity building, research and development, security and resilience in areas of critical information infrastructure, 5G, Internet of Things, AI, among others. So Again, India and Japan are coming closer, both in terms of physical security infrastructure and also in digital security infrastructure. So we are strengthening our special relationship. Pandemic could push 150 million into extreme poverty according to World Bank. So World Bank has taken notice of the problem of poverty that has been exacerbated by this pandemic and the lockdowns that have happened. So World Bank has come out with some observations, and it has said that more and more people would be pushed into extreme poverty, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. These are the areas which would be worst hit. Now, extreme poverty, it says that daily income of $1.50, less than $1.50 would push people into extreme poverty. And then World Bank also gave some steps for recovery. So let's look at them. So the bank said that the global extreme poverty is expected to rise for the first time in 20 years because of COVID-19, and it will increase the impact of conflict and climate change, because conflict and climate change was already pushing poverty, right? Especially in sub-Saharan Africa and also in South Asia. We'll discuss in detail one day that how climate change directly impacts the poor the most, and also climate change leads to poverty. For example, desertification, it converts rich fertile lands into deserts and it takes away the livelihood of people, right? So there are many steps or scenarios in which climate change exacerbates poverty. Same goes for conflict. For example, if you look at Syria and other conflict-ridden places, people are facing large-scale humanitarian crisis and they have been pushed to extreme poverty because there is no productive activity. How will they earn a livelihood? Because conflict disrupts everything. So pandemic has added to that problem, and for the first time in 20 years, the poverty rate or the global poverty is expected to rise. The sub-Saharan African region and the South Asian will be badly hit. These are the numbers, but they are open for interpretations. Now, extreme poverty, this global recession along with the COVID-19 restrictions could push over 1.4% of world's population into extreme poverty. And the pandemic itself may push another 88 million to 115 million into extreme poverty, which have to live on less than $1.50 per day. So total, there would be 150 million individuals in this scenario. So World Bank basically compared the scenario where the COVID was not there and the impact of COVID, and then they have come up with these figures. Now, many of these newly poor individuals will be from countries who are already facing the problem of high poverty rate, and also from the middle income countries like India, China, all the developing countries which are the middle income countries, they will also slip below poverty line. Now the solutions, now this is going to be a serious setback. So the countries, they have to think of a different approach in the post-COVID scenario towards economy. They have to move businesses, sectors, innovation, skill, labor, capital to new directions and push them into new directions to actually recover out of this situation. Else the situation seems very grim. So there is another combination of pandemic and poverty. We have seen it in our country as well. Scenes of migrant laborers walking hundreds of kilometers to reach back to their native places, right? So this is the role of COVID-19 in terms of poverty. Natural gas marketing reforms get cabinet nod. So there's not much to explain here. These are simple factual things. So what the government intends to achieve through this is to standardize the procedure to discover the price of gas in the market and also to increase competitiveness in the market. So let us just briefly go through this. This would bring uniformity to the bidding process across various contractual regimes and policies to avoid ambiguity and contribute towards ease of doing business. So these are the aims and objectives of this reform. It has permitted affiliate companies to participate in the bidding process in the view of open, transparent and electronic bidding. And this new bidding platform will promote market price discovery of natural gas, which is produced from fields, and producers already have a pricing freedom. But if this is a e-bidding platform, then producers from different fields would be bidding for prices, right? So it would lead to better price discovery. This will also facilitate and promote competition in marketing of gas. And if in a bidding process only affiliate companies are bidding and not other companies, then the bidding process would have to be conducted again. Now government expects to move to spur production in infrastructure and marketing of natural gas while also creating jobs in gas consuming sectors including MSMEs. So see, in news like this, there is nothing to explain basically because these are just factual things. So that is why I'm going through this news so hurriedly. You can take your screenshots and you can read it in your leisure time. Another day, another news about Google. So now Google is facing antitrust case in India over smart TVs. So what is antitrust? That when one company or a group of companies, they use their monopoly to unfairly distort market prices or the products or any market conditions, then that is known as antitrust. So Google has control over the Android operating system. So in this case, it is alleged that the companies or the players in the market who want to customize or change the Android operating system as per their components, they are not able to do so because Google is forcing them to use the operating system in a certain manner. And the Competition Commission of India, which is the anti-monopoly sort of body in India, it is looking into this problem. Google says that it has done nothing wrong, but this is the fourth antitrust case of Google in India. This is not the first case. And in addition to that, Google is also facing antitrust cases in USA, and China is also looking to open antitrust proceedings against Google. So let us see what this is about. So Google is alleged to have abused its Android operating system's position in smart television market. Competition Commission of India looking into the allegations of its anti-competitive practices by creating barriers for firms wanting to use or develop modified versions of Android for smart TVs. I've already told you, such as Amazon Fire TV operating system. Now Google has denied any wrongdoing, but there are more antitrust cases. This is the fourth major antitrust challenge in India, and India is one of its key markets. Google also faces antitrust challenges in US and potential in China over how it allegedly uses its dominance of Android mobile operating system to stifle competition. Now, what are antitrust laws? The antitrust laws are regulations that monitor the distribution of economic power in business, making sure that healthy competition is allowed to flourish and economies can grow. So this is about creating a level playing field and that no company or a group of companies can form monopolies and distort market and stifle competition. Antitrust laws apply to nearly all industries and sectors, touching every level of business, including manufacturing, transportation, distribution, and marketing. So again, one case of Google. Google is in news these days in India, but for wrong reasons. If you remember, we have been discussing Google versus Paytm, then the mini app store, and then this antitrust case. 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So this prize has gone to Emmanuel Carpenter and Jennifer A. Duanda. Now these two are women and they are only the 6th and 7th women till now to win a Nobel in chemistry, right? Now this is about their research into gene editing and CRISPR. We have already discussed this earlier. So let us quickly go through their contributions, right? So the Nobel Prize was given to them for CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors, a method of genome editing. Now this is a DNA strand. These are the combination AT, GC. You must have read about it in science and tech. Now CRISPR stands for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. It refers to repeated sequence in bacteria and rkDNA. These sequences are part of an immune system. If a bacterium survives a viral infection, it adds a section of the virus genetic code to the CRISPR region of its own to serve as a memory if it's infected again. Carpenter and Duanda saw that this could be used as a gene editing tool. So they identified this in bacterium and they thought that this could be applied to human genomes as well, right? Now this is important. It is just like a memory system that whatever happens, your memory stores it. So the bacterium got sick and then its body produced antibodies, and when those antibodies were produced, so the bacterial added that antibody to its gene sequence or DNA sequence so that next time it does not carry it and it can pass on that gene to its offspring. So its offspring would be naturally immune to such a disease. Now how does this process work of gene editing CRISPR-9? So the first step of the CRISPR gene editing process is creation of a strand of guide RNA. This matches the DNA sequence where we want to make a cut. a scissor protein Cas9. I've already told you that Cas9 acts as a scissor protein, binds to the guide RNA. So you prepare an RNA which mimics the DNA sequence, and then you make a cut and then you insert it. The guide RNA searches for the target section of DNA and transports the scissor protein to it. The scissor protein cuts the DNA at this point. So it is just like making a cut through a scissor. The cell will try and repair the cut DNA. This process is error prone, disrupting the gene function. If we add a template, the cell will use this to carry out the repair, allowing us to edit the genetic code. So this is too technical. You don't really need to get into it. You just need to understand that they are editing the genetic code by inserting RNA sequence into DNA sequence through a template process, and that leads to an edited DNA or a new type of DNA. Now, why does this research matter? The ability to edit genomes has already found uses in plant breeding. Therapies which use it to treat some types of cancer are already in clinical trials, and it's hoped that it may lead to cures for inherited diseases. So for example, there is a disease called hemophilia, and the royal family in the UK, the so-called royal family, they suffer from it. So if this gene or edited gene could be inserted into their offspring through ART or any other technology, then their future generations won't be carrying that disease. So it is a very, very good thing, but it has its flip side as well, because last year or last to last year, there was a scientist in China who claimed to have made designer babies using this CRISPR technology. So it can be both good and bad, and there would be many ethical questions involved with this. But overall, this is a great contribution to the field of science, because it not only has applications in the field of medicine, but also agriculture, right? For improving crop varieties. Probably one day it could give solution to hunger, world hunger. It could make plants practically immune to diseases. So there are many, many applications of this Cas9 technology and gene editing, and that is why they rightly deserve the Nobel Prize. Gig work and its cute terms. So basically this editorial is from the Hindu. Now this is a good editorial because it talks about the gig workers. Now first of all, what are gig workers? Non-traditional or gig work consists of income earning activities outside of traditional long-term employer-employee relationships. Like the food delivery boys that work for Swiggy or Amazon delivery guys, these all people constitute gig work. And now gig work and platform work, both of them are almost the same thing. It has become something really, really big in our country because the quantity and the scale of people who are employed in this work, every day you can see thousands of delivery persons delivering essential stuff, and more so their work has become very, very commendable and respectable during this pandemic because they have enabled us to get stuff delivered in the safety of our homes without the need of venturing out. So these people are very, very important. So the 3 labor laws that have been passed, they identify or they recognize the gig workers, gig and platform workers, and they recognize them as new occupational categories in the making, in a bid to keep India's young workforce secure as it embraces new kinds of work like delivery in the digital economy. But what the problem is, this person is talking about Swiggy, that Swiggy has reduced the base pay from 35 to 10 rupees per delivery order. One day we'll discuss this as well. Now this is not that important for now. Now what these codes do is, once they recognize the gig workers, right? And I also told you that these codes, they define a worker in terms of salary, 18,000 rupees and less. Anyone who earns 18,000 and less per month is a worker as per the labor codes, right? So under these labor codes, these gig and platform workers, they get benefits, right? They can claim benefits, but they don't get no rights of other permanent employees or other kind of employees that work in a traditional workspace, right? So that is the first point. Now the second point that she makes is, though they are eligible for benefits like maternity benefits, leave, PF, etc., but there is no guarantee of them getting access to those benefits, because then again it is a gray area, right? So let us quickly see what she's saying. The code on wages tries to expand this idea by using wages as the primary definition. I told you. Even so, The terms gig worker, platform worker, and gig economy appear elsewhere in Code on Social Security. So she's telling us that the labor bills, they duly recognize the gig platform workers, right? Now she says that these laws are prescriptive, that is, what is written within them creates limits to what rights can be demanded and how these rights can be demanded, right? But she then tells us that the gig and platform workers do not get the rights in the traditional sense. Then she tells that the platform delivery people can claim benefits but not labor rights. So this distinction makes them the beneficiaries of state programs. This does not allow them to go to court to demand better and stable pay or regulate the algorithms that assign the task. This also means that the government or courts cannot pull up platform companies for their choice of pay or how long they ask people to work. So these companies, the delivery companies, be it Swiggy, Food Panda or any other, or Zomato or Amazon, they can dictate the terms, but at least these workers, they have some form of security, that is the social security. Now the main role of the laws for a platform worker is to make available benefits and safety nets from the government or platform companies. Even though platforms are part of the idea of how work will evolve in future, the current laws do not see them as future industrial workers. So then there is again a distinction between the gig and platform workers and the industrial workers. Now she tells us that there are no guarantees. In the Codes on Social Security 2020, platform workers are now eligible for benefits. They are eligible, right? Maternity, life, disability, old age, pension, provident, and so on. However, eligibility does not mean the benefits are guaranteed. So this is like they're saying that they are eligible, but they don't have any guarantee or legal guarantee to get them. None of these are secure benefits, which means that from time to time, the central government can formulate welfare schemes that cover these aspects of personal and work security, but they are not guaranteed. Actualizing these benefits will depend on the political will at the central and state level. So this is all about this editorial, the important part. Rest you can happily ignore. See, we have a different philosophy. We are not going to indulge in reading each and every line of the editorial. We will only tell you the relevant part, and we will not endorse any political ideology of any side, right, left, center. We will not get into it, right? That is our stand. So this was a factual thing, important thing. That is why we are discussing. Cost of political posturing. So this editorial again is from the Hindu, and this is talking about the White House rule on salary floor for H-1B visas, and this is going to have serious economic implications. Now I have just created a sort of summary for you. This is all that you know. So first, the Trump administration banned issuance of new H-1B visas and new green cards, but then later it was overturned by a judge, right? Federal judge blocked the visa ban. Now it has raised the minimum salary for those arriving on H-1B visas. Now, first of all, H-1B visas are for highly skilled workers. In a year, US issues 85,000 H-1B visas globally, of which 20,000 are given to graduate students and 65,000 to private sector applications. And India gets nearly 70% of these H-1B visas. Now, Trump has raised the minimum salary for those arriving on H-1B visas. That means those companies in America that hire Indians to go to work in America, they'll have to pay more. So they would want to cut their costs. So this is expected to cut visa applications by 33%. And this ban on visa, which was overturned but still it is applicable in some areas, could affect 219,000 workers in all. Now this move has been challenged. Like I told you, a federal judge blocked the visa ban, and US manufacturing and industry associations, including big tech companies, are resisting this, and they are also criticizing Trump for this. But Trump has to cater to his home audience more so in the coming election. So that is why he is doing all of this. Now this is the cost that it will seriously hit US import of service from India, estimating to be about 29.6 billion, 4.9% more than in 2017, and 134 more than 2008 level. So this is the level around $30 billion. So this would be lost because of this visa hike, and the ban on visa issuance could impact 219,000 workers. So this is all about this editorial. This is all you needed to know about it. Making AI work for India. Now this is one of those rare editorials that are extremely good And almost every line and every word of this editorial is very, very important. And for a change, this is from Indian Express, which is a big surprise. Now, this editorial is in many parts. First, it tells us about the opportunities that India has in the field of AI, opportunities and the skill set or the advantages that we already have for leveraging AI. Then it tells us what is AI, right? Then it tells us about the various applications of AI, and it gives beautiful examples of how AI is being used in different sections and sectors of Indian society, right? So let us look at it. I will give you an overall because it won't be possible for me as well to read the whole editorial. So you just take a screenshot, and it would be better that you go online and you download it. Just write the same words in your Google search and the version will be available there, and you can copy that because this is extremely good editorial. Now let us look into it. Now why he's talking about this? Because I told you in yesterday's news that India is conducting RAISE 2020 summit, right? So he says, first of all, countries across the world are making effort to be part of AI-led digital economy, which is estimated to contribute about 15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030, right? So this is a very, very big amount. Now talking about opportunities for India, right? So India has a AI for all strategy. It has a vast pool of AI trained workforce, and it has an emerging startup ecosystem, right? So it has a unique opportunity to be a major contributor to AI driven solutions that can revolutionize healthcare, agriculture, manufacturing, and other things. Again, here is talking about the opportunities, young population, skilled and eager to adopt AI, right? India has been ranked second on the Stanford AI Vibrancy Index, primarily on the account of its large AI trained workforce. Our leading technology institutes, IIT, NITs, etc., have the potential to be cradle of AI researchers and startups. India startups are innovating and developing solutions with AI across education, health, financial services. And then he has given examples. I'll just get to them. Now, first of all, what is AI? It is a branch of computer science. I told you in a previous video as well about AI. So it is a branch of computer science which is concerned with developing machines that can complete tasks that typically require human intelligence, like problem solving, right? And with the explosion of available data, expansion of cloud computing, the field is witnessing rapid advancements in AI, machine learning, and deep learning. Again, I would suggest you to do your own research about what is machine learning and deep learning. Please do that. You will also learn a lot of things. Don't blindly depend on anybody, including me. Now, in the field of health, what all things are being done? Machine learning based deep learning algorithms in AI can give insights to healthcare providers, predicting future events for patients. Also, early detection and prevention of diseases by capturing vitals of patients. Now, Bangalore based startup has developed non-invasive AI based technology to screen for early signs of breast cancer. Now, see, these are examples that you can quote in your mains examination. So these are very, very, very important examples. Then hospitals in Tamil Nadu are using machine learning algorithm to detect diabetic retinopathy, which is basically to address the challenge of shortage of eye doctors. So see how innovative they are. Then the role of AI in COVID fight. First of all, COVID-19 response, Government of India used AI-enabled chatbots in MyGov sites, right? Then ICMR also used a Watson Assistant, which is an AI platform to answer specific queries of frontline staff and data entry operators for the COVID relief and COVID fight. Then because of AI, I have told you when I discussed the vaccine development phases, that is, one is the preclinical phase, and usually it used to take almost 10 to 20 years, but because of AI, we have narrowed it down to months. So again, AI has played a very, very important role. So you can read it. That is a summary I'm telling you. Then AI also has application in agriculture sector, like for water management, crop insurance, pest control, etc. For example, image recognition, drones, and automatic intelligent networking can help farmers kill weed more effectively, harvest better crops, right? He gives an example of pilot project in 3 districts, Bhopal, Rajkot, and Nanded, where AI-based decision support platform combined with weather sensing technology to give farm level advisories. and basically tells the farmers when to sow their seeds, and they have experienced a 10 to 30% increase in yield. So these are all the examples. You please read them and make your notes. Then flood forecasting, we just discussed flood forecasting in Google based AI. So flood forecasting model is also being implemented in Bihar, right? And it is covering a large area and 200 million people. So it is giving alerts 48 hours in advance. We just understood how it is just one day. So 48 hours, that makes it 2 days, still a better forecast than one day, right? More importantly, these alerts are being given in 9 languages and are localized to specific areas, and they also use infographics so that messages reach across to the intended audience. Then in terms of education, CBSE has made AI knowledge and integrated AI knowledge in school passing out students, right? So it is a part of a curriculum. They are getting basic knowledge, and government school students are also being taught AI. 11,000 students have already got the lessons of AI, basic course of AI. Then in terms of economy, he's telling us that digital inclusion in India could have a ripple effect on economic growth and prosperity. Analysts have predicted that AI can help add up to 957 billion to the Indian economy by 2035. So this is the potential. Earlier we saw 15 trillion to the world economy by 2030, and only for India 957 billion by 2035, right? So the opportunity is very, very big. And by 2025, data and AI can add over 500 billion, right? And almost 20 million jobs to Indian economy. So this is the importance of AI for the economy. Then what is India's strategy for AI? We have AI for all strategy, which focuses on responsible AI, building AI solutions at scale with an intent to make India an AI garage of the world, where India would be a trusted nation to which the world can outsource AI related work. So just as countries around the world, they outsource their software work to India. So we want that in future, they should outsource their AI related work, and trusted means that we will ensure their data safety. And for that, we are also working on a legal framework. So AI derives strength from data. To this end, the government is in process of putting in place a strong legal framework governing the data of Indians. The legislation stems from a desire to become a highly secure and ethical AI powerhouse. So India wants to be a powerhouse, but a secure and ethical powerhouse, right? So this is about this editorial. I'm telling you, this is very, very important. It first tells us the opportunities at global scale, that $15.7 trillion for global market by 2030, right? Then what are the opportunities for India, right? We saw that. Then what is AI? We saw that. Then applications of AI in different sectors like health, agriculture, flood forecasting, right? Economy. And we also saw examples of AI being implemented in different fields, like Bengaluru based startup has made AI for detecting breast cancer, and use of AI in the COVID fight also in India, right? Then agriculture, AI can be used for telling farmers when to sow seeds. And we saw models that have been implemented, and the farmers have experienced increase in yields by 10 to 30%, right? Then for flood forecasting in Bihar, it is being implemented, and 48 hours advance warnings. Then education, CBSE and government schools, almost 11,000 government school students have got the basic AI course, right? Then for economy, we saw that alone for India by 2035, 957 billion could be added to our economy, and by 2025, almost 20 million jobs to the Indian economy. Then we saw a strategy, AI for all. We want to become an AI powerhouse, but we also want to be ethical and a trusted nation. And for that, we are making a robust legal framework for data protection and data security. So again, I'm telling you, exceptional editorial, especially for those who are preparing for mains, and this will be important for your 2021 as well. US House panel slams big tech's monopoly, urges breakups. So another news about the monopoly and market distortions by big techs. So basically the US House of Representatives panel, which has been looking into these big tech companies for the past 15 months, it has said that these largest technology companies are following the malpractices and they're distorting the markets. They said that Amazon, Apple, Facebook and Google exercise and abuse their monopoly power and call for the most sweeping changes to antitrust laws in half a century. They basically said that these companies should be broken up into smaller constituents, and the market regulators and the antitrust bodies should be given sweeping powers to deal with such. They are saying that their power is akin to the big oil and railroad companies that used to be in America. So this monopoly needs to be broken. But then again, it has divided the Democrats and Republicans into how they should tackle this problem. We will discuss it once it gets bigger. The companies had abused their dominant positions, setting and often dictating prices and rules for commerce, search, advertising, social networking, and publishing. This is true. These are two big companies, and they basically control everything in the digital space and also in the digital equipments. Now, as a solution, the lawmakers recommended restoring competition by effectively breaking up the companies and also emboldening the agencies that police the market concentration. And also they should throw up hurdles to these companies whenever they try to acquire a startup, because many times it happens that a startup comes up and it could potentially pose a challenge to these companies, but those startups are acquired by these companies. For example, you know now that Facebook owns WhatsApp, it also owns Instagram, right? So any competition that Facebook sees, it will acquire that company or that startup. They also propose changing antitrust law to restore competition. So again, clamor is growing against these big companies, especially in US. Now let us see where that leads. India can be among top 5 in defense industry. Now this statement was made by Raksha Mantri. Now why I am telling you, because there are some good points about the defense industry in India and what advantages do we have. So India is one of the largest defense industrial ecosystems in Asia, important, and we aspire to build further on our strengths. We want to make India one of the top 5 countries of the world in aerospace and defense industries from design to production. That means the entire supply chain, that is from inception, design to production, right? 100% made in India. India is one of the few countries in the world to produce 4th generation fighter aircraft, nuclear submarines, battle tanks, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the aim is to make it one of the top 5 globally in aerospace and defense industries. So we make everything: 4th generation fighter, aircraft, nuclear submarines, battle tanks, ICMBs. So these are our strengths, and we have the largest defense industrial ecosystem in Asia. So India could become a powerhouse. Right now, India is among one of the top importers of defense products, but we want to be one of the top exporters of defense products, and for that we need to promote our defense industry. It will not only promote the defense industry but overall manufacturing sector. It will also help to build many ancillary industries, right? And it will support many jobs. So this is a very good thing, and this will also lead to high indigenous content in our defense technology. And see, whatever technology is developed, though it starts from the defense sector, it always goes on to get transferred to the civil sector and improve their lives. For example, internet and so many things which started in the defense sector, but now they are an integral part of the civilian life. So very, very important. Now, very small news, but it could get big in future. So that is why I am just introducing you to this concept. So GJM, which is the Gurkha Janmukti Morcha, demands formation of Gurkhaland state. If you remember, recently we discussed an article where Gurkhas are asking protection under clause 6 of Assam Act 1985, right, to be included in the definition of Assamese, or to be given the constitutional protection and the facilities that are given under clause 6, and they want those to be extended to the Gurkha community. So Gurkha community has presence in many places in the northeast and in West Bengal. So their demands are very, very legible. So this is one of those demands. Let us see. So the Union Ministry of State for Home, G. Krishna Reddy, he met the representative of Bimal Garu faction of GJM. Now there is another faction of GJM which is led by Binoy Tamang, right? And they are in power, in control of what is known as GTA, which is Gorkhaland Territorial Administration. I'll just show you. See, this is the area in West Bengal bordering Sikkim, right? These are all the autonomous regions. One day we'll discuss them in detail, okay? So not only he wants a full statehood, he also demanded scheduled tribe status to 11 Gurkha sub-communities. Now what is Gurkhaland Territorial Administration? It is a regional autonomous body formed as a result of tripartite agreement between West Bengal Government Center and GJM in 2011. So right now, this is all that you need to know about this. Once it gets big, we'll discuss this in detail. So folks, this is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. Also press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new video that we post. And if you liked our video, please give us a thumbs up. And please do connect with us on our Instagram page, UPSC for Everyone. See you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.